Kuzu Zampo, and a very warm welcome to all our viewers. This is BBS Channel 2, and I'm your host for the next 1 hour Karma Dendrup. This is your weekly dose of Buddhism, Jangchub Shing, and we are continuing our conversation with Dr. Robert Thurman. Doctor, in our previous session, in our previous episode, we were speaking about karmic biology.
Right.
A term coined by Doctor, if I'm not mistaken.
That's true.
Las. So is there anything more that Doctor would like to add on to karmic biology?
Well, yes, in the sense that it has to do with the larger issue of breaking down the Buddhist educational movement and restoring what it was in ancient India in the time of Nalanda Monastic University, and where it's part of general knowledge. And they teach medicine, and they taught architecture, and they taught literature, and all sorts of things. And it isn't just, something in a temple. There were temples, of course, in the monastery, just like there are chapels. But the main thing is the learning, because they're focusing on the fact that Buddha's own enlightenment came through learning. As you know, in Sherab, which is the wisdom that liberates from suffering in Buddhism, has 3 levels. The wisdom born of learning, they usually say hearing, but they mean hearing because in those days they didn't have so many printed books. So the wisdom born of learning, although on TV or in radio you can be hearing, again. Wisdom born of learning, wisdom born of critical reflection, thinking carefully and rationally, debating a little bit, arguing, developing doubt and criticism, and finally wisdom born of concentration or concentrated meditation. So if we jump to meditation right away, without having learned and without having developed critical reflection, then the meditation will not take us too far. It'll give us a calmness of mind, but it won't do that. So learning was from the beginning a key thing, So that's all I want to say about that. And, the evolution is a very good explanation on the physical level of the relationship between the human and the animal forms. And of course, from our Buddhist point of view, various other kinds of creatures like angels, gods, demons, pretas, we have, which they say hungry ghosts, but they're not really ghosts. They are very hungry beings, like something like insects or worse than insects. And then hell being, we even have hells, But so evolution describes how beings move into different forms in a very good way, on a physical way, with the concept of the physical gene, And we have Mishik Betigle, we call it in Tantra, and in exoteric Buddhism we call it Santana, Chitta Santana, the continuum of the mind, And it was always a big problem between Buddhists and Hindus in India because Buddhists say there's no fixed dag. Dagme is a major, selflessness is a big thing. But by selflessness they meant, Rangshinji Drubi dag, meaning a self-established independently of relationships to anything else that is fixed and always the same. Like Karma Dendrup always has the same self, no matter what. When you're 1 year old, when you're 100 years old, same thing. And me too, I have the same thing. And Buddha rejected that. He said, nobody has any part of themselves that is unrelated to their body, mind, other beings, the air, earth, fire, water, air, whatever it is. Everything about us is totally related. So that means that the self is, just how you organize your nexus of experience, so everything changing inside you. But you have this continuum, Chitta Santana, and that's what goes from life to life. Because the Hindus used to say, well, if you have no self, how can you be reborn? But the point is, how can you even be here? You have no self, But the point is, you have no absolute self. But the absolute wouldn't be anywhere anyway, because it doesn't relate to any place. Absolute means, Majeba, Makyeba, unborn, uncreated, The relative is the only thing that is located in a place, So we do have relative self, which has a continuation and always changes, okay? So therefore, that Chitta Santana, or in the Tantric Abhidharma, we call it Mishik Bitigle, or sometimes even Buddha nature, or something like that, Deshek Ningbo. And that is what goes from life to life. And in a way, I like to say that's like the third gene You have the genes of your parents, which match up in a certain way and create a combination of your physical body. But you pick those parents coming from Bardo, from previous life, because you have a gene that likes the human form, wants to be human. If you're a crocodile and you die, and your Chitta Gotra, your Chitta Santana as a crocodile, is going along in Bardo, and it sees a couple of human beings, it's not going to think that's a very nice place to be. I don't want to look like that. I don't have any scales. I don't have big jaw. I can't swim in the ground. Like crocodile has a strong scaly armor, very strong creature. Why would I want to be some wimpy human with no scale and a soft skin and no teeth, And so that third gene picks the genes of the parents, you see. So that's a very important thing, just to unpack more about karmic biology. And when people see about that, then they will still study about the genes, and they will study about, all this kind of medicine, the high-tech medicine is trying to figure out how cancer works, and they're trying to find some gene that will be resistant to cancer. They're doing all this artificial stuff in the micro realm. But the fact is, in the last 60 years, they haven't improved their percentage of curing cancer, actually. Like a few percent, 4 or 5%. Some of the other diseases they have improved, but not cancer. So in a way, they're kind of going down into a cul-de-sac, like a blank canyon, where there's no way out. And meanwhile, they don't study food, they don't study nutrition, they don't study spiritual health, they don't study mind-body interaction very much, Some people do, but they're considered kind of like complementary, alternative, fringe people in the medical world. And actually, they're doing the real healing, in fact, rather than the people with the high-tech stuff. But, high-tech is also good. I'm not against it. I'm just saying it has to be balanced with a proper worldview. And we need to think in terms of, and what I would like the theme of today, of this session to be, we need to think of where in the educational curriculum of the lay people in the ordinary schools, the Buddhist scientific worldview can be shared with the modern one and compared, so that it's not seen as just only the modern worldview, the materialist worldview. That's my thing, and I want to talk about Shunyata, Dongbanyit, as well as and science and mathematics as well.
As we venture into Tongbanyi, while I was researching Doctor, I came to find out that Doctor has a work called The Essential Tibetan Buddhism. Something like that.
Essential Tibetan Buddhism?
Yes.
Right.
Doctor has translated a work like that. Now, my question is, because within the Tibetan Buddhist world or universe, there are things which are said to be secret, in a sense that the recipient of that knowledge would not comprehend it. But then there are people who can misuse or abuse that doctrine.
Right.
In the fact that I am, for instance, even a short interview that I did with Sogyal Rinpoche, after it went on air, I had viewers who said that, I am Buddha by nature, so thus I don't have to do this, or I don't have to do that. So that misunderstanding could also be a problem. I would like to know Doctor's perspective on that, on what are the secret doctrines, and is there such a thing that that I am not worthy of that doctrine, or that doctrine is not meant for me, or not meant for women? So if anything that Doctor could share on that.
Well, that's a good subject, and it's something new actually in the history of Buddhism. But then again, Buddhism was never always exactly the same, It changed as the circumstances of the societies in which it served. If we understand that Buddhism's major role in the world has been as an educational institution, not so much as a temple. That the temple was for the people who, because in the old days in agricultural societies, not so many people were educated and literate, and they had to produce subsistence, livelihood, and work in the farm and so forth. So they weren't approaching to study. Do you know what I mean? India was the richest of all the ancient countries on Eurasia in the Buddha's time. So the cities were bigger, and there was a better agricultural surplus, and more people were educated actually than in other, like China or Europe. They were more backward, or in Persia even, they were more backward than India. That's why Buddhism came out of India. And so what was secret in those ancient societies because people would misunderstand, became more and more well known, so that by the end of the Indian Buddhism, which was only destroyed by external invasion from outside, from around 500 of the Common Era to 1,000 or 1,100 of the Common Era, actually the Tantra, which is that esoteric stuff, was pretty well known, actually, pretty widely known within the educated people, you know. And even then, probably it was also abused and misunderstood to some extent. So there was a basic idea that it was like advanced study. But it isn't just that somebody's not worthy of it. It isn't just that there's something going on that is evil or weird and therefore other people will behave. It is just that it's like you don't try to do quantum physics without learning ABC or 1, 2, 3, you know, multiplication table in mathematics. You have to, it's advanced study type thing, you know. For example, if you, in the 20th century, at the very end of 19th and early 20th century, Sigmund Freud came up with the theory of the unconscious in Western psychology. He started what is called depth psychology. And when he started that, the European people were very freaked out. In a way, it connected with their Christian idea of the sinful nature of man. But in another way, nobody wanted to admit that they had these underlying instincts and drives. So he was kind of persecuted at first, Freud was. But then it became sort of known, you know. But on the other hand, even today, if you would go to some simple farming community in Arkansas or Kansas or somewhere in the United States, supposedly advanced industrial country, and you would start talking about Freud unconscious and how everybody wanted to do every horrible thing to everybody else, they would run you out of town and tell you to go find Jesus and forget. They would be upset. So in that sense, even psychoanalytic depth psychology is a little bit almost esoteric today. You know, it's for some advanced people who want to really work with their own mind. Or someone who's really sick, then they try to help them because they are frightened of what's in their own mind, and you have to try to reassure them and whatever. You know, psychotherapy, you know. So in that sense, the Tantra is the most advanced teaching Buddha gave. And from the point of view of us Tibetan and Bhutanese and Mahayana Buddhists, Buddha did teach, and Japanese Tantric Buddhists, Buddha did teach Tantra. It wasn't just made up later by other people, just like Buddha did teach Mahayana. In a way, in the time of Buddha, he even said, Mahayana is not going to be widespread right away. It'll be a little bit esoteric. The whole regular Mahayana, you know, sutra system, as we might say, you know, because people are not ready for the deep teaching of non-duality. They need dualistic Buddhism where they become monks and they create sangha and they think that nirvana is outside the world and they're going to get out of life, no more birth, like it said. And we need a lot of monks and nuns to create a more peaceful atmosphere in the society at his time. And in about 400 years, Nagarjuna will come and he will rediscover the Mahayana Sutras, my Mahayana teachings, and they will spread them in the world. Buddha said that himself. We believe that, and I think that's true. Modern historians don't believe that because they think Buddha was just an ordinary person like them. They can't imagine that he would have such a good vision of the development of human society, like a sort of super sociologist, saying when it would be ready for whichever teaching, you know. But I think those of us who see the Buddha as a super normal and super intelligent being, we think that that's very possible. So, you know, the thing about how we all have Buddha nature only relates to the fact that we have the capability of becoming enlightened. It doesn't mean we are already enlightened. In another sense, of course, you can say when we become enlightened, then time has a different perception experience for us, and we look back at ourselves and we realize we were already one with Buddha, all the Buddhas, even then. For example, to right this minute, all the Buddhas, they perceive you and me as indivisible from their body and mind. Like, they don't see us as different from themselves. But they realize that we see ourselves differently because of our ignorance, and therefore we in no way does it do us any good just to say, I'm a Buddha, I'm one with Buddha. It a little bit maybe makes people feel reassured. But on the other hand, if they say, I'm with Buddha, so now I'm going to do some horrible things, then they're going to be Buddha as some kind of horrible insect or in hell. The person in hell can say, I'm one with Buddha, but I'm not having a comfortable time of it, you know. from my bad evolution, from my bad karma. But on the other hand, I consider the tantric teachings, which are not invented in Tibet or in Bhutan. They came from India, from the most sophisticated universities of the human mind that have ever been developed by human beings, in my opinion. Much more sophisticated than Western psychology, which is only a century or two old and is imprisoned by the logta of materialism. So they think it's just a brain, and all they want is more drugs and more electrical stimulations and neuroscience, and they don't think that you can learn the mind from within the mind. They don't think they can mobilize your mind to develop your mind. They don't agree with that. So they're imprisoned by that, And our psychology the Buddhist psychology is much better in that sense. So they take responsibility for how we use our mind, because that will influence the condition of our mind. And anyway, within that mind science, what I would call mind science, the tantric level of it is the most subtle and the most sophisticated. It's what enabled the Buddhists to understand the processes of death and rebirth and the between state, the pardo state, and even the processes of sleep and dream in a much more sophisticated way than anybody else has done. Although I think Hindu yogis and Taoist yogis in China, under interaction with Buddhists over hundreds of years, they also developed good understanding, I believe. And some Christian mystics and Sufi mystics also. But as a systematic psychology, I think the Buddhist one is pretty much unmatched. You never want to compare religion and say one is better than another, and we don't do that as a Buddhist. But you do compare sciences, and you say this is wrong, and or scientific results. You say this one is correct, this one is incorrect. You have to do that, like with mathematics. 2 and 2 is 4, it isn't 5.
Speaking about maths, yes, the doctor was just speaking about maths, and doctor also mentioned Nagarjuna and Shunyata and emptiness.
Yes.
So everybody who's watched Jangchub Shing since its inception, they've always been asking about, or we've had callers whenever we go live about some questions alluding towards emptiness. So today, if doctor would be so kind enough to speak to us about Shunyata.
Now, what's very interesting is that the decimal system, which makes computers possible, binary system, but the decimal system, the Romans, the Persians, the Greeks, the Chinese did not invent the decimal system. They had no idea of the decimal system. So they were having a hard time writing long numbers, when they were doing their astronomy and so on. The Indians invented the decimal system, and the word for zero, which is the essence of the decimal system, was shunya. So shunya is the word for zero in the ancient Indian mathematics. And so therefore shunya in that mathematics doesn't mean nothing. It means an open place where you can put something. So similarly, the emptiness is not nothingness. It's very important, very different word. Nothingness is abhavatva in Sanskrit. Shunyata, it means, and shunyata comes from a verb root shvi, which means to swell. Like a seed, when you take a flat seed and you put it, it becomes wet in the ground, then it swells up. Then there's an open space inside it. Like a balloon, when you blow air in a balloon, it swells, so it's open inside, that means. And so so shunyata in a way means it's a pure negation, like zero, and therefore creates an open space in which things can happen. And that's the key to shunyata. So shunyata is what makes possible the relative world. Buddha's discovery of shunyata was not a discovery of nothingness. What he discovered about nothingness, luckily, is that it's nothing. So therefore nobody can discover it, and it's just, we don't be afraid of it, and it's not there. That's the great thing about it. And everything is always something. But what emptiness is that everything is relative, because every seemingly separate thing is empty of any absolute essence of its separateness. So therefore there's nothing in it that can make it an independently separate thing. So that means like my finger is not a thing in itself. And we have a lot of terms for this, swabhava, swalakshana, swarupa, is from Sanskrit, or rangitsenyid in Tibetan, or Dzongkha, rangitsenyid, rangi ngobo, or rangshin, and then you go Rangshinji Druba, Ranginguo Druba, Rangiseniti Druba. And these are different levels of the false idea that each thing has a substance in it that makes it sort of what it is out of itself, rather than it is what it is only by its relationships to things, which themselves are not anything in themselves, but in relationship they work. So, Buddha preceded Einstein by 2,550 years in the theory of relativity, in that he discovered relativity. And relativity just means there's no absolute that makes relative things happen. It's just relative. Or in a way, or you could put it this way, the absolute is the freedom for all the relative things to happen. Now, for example, when people say emptiness, they tend to feel freaked out because they think, oh, that means I don't exist. I was just joking around with a lady downstairs, and I said, well, who are you? So she said, I don't exist. Because she was talking to the professor like Buddhism, meaning I'm empty. And in a way, it's true, we don't exist in the way we think we exist. Like, I think I'm really Bob Thurman. And therefore, there's an essence in me that's the real Bob somewhere. And I don't know where that Bob is. Maybe it's like on some neuron in my brain. Maybe it's in my heart. Maybe there's a little mini me, a micro me in an atom somewhere in my heart center or something like that. There's all kind of fantasies people have. But if any doctor would take, they would take me apart, they'd find no Bob inside. They would, my face changes every year. What I looked like when I was 15 is nothing like what I look like now, and so on. But there's a continuum. Every cell in my body, the biologist will say, has changed since a year ago. I think every year, every cell, every atom changes. And cosmic rays are going in and out of us, and we are just this complete buzzing, blooming swirl of energy. But I go around thinking I'm real Bob. So then, because I'm hanging on to this identity of real Bob, I'm different from Karmadendra. I'm not Karmadendra. So therefore, you're other to me. And that's the whole source of human suffering, according to, or animal suffering even, not just human, according to Buddha. Because a person gets this delusion that I'm just separate from everything, and then everything else is so much bigger than me, it overwhelms me. It comes to me as death, it comes to me as suffering, it comes to me as enemies, it comes to me as, I just can't deal with. If you think you're the one in the world, you can't cope and you can't overwhelm the rest of the world. It will overwhelm you. That's really all the truth of suffering is. So by discovering relativity, what the Buddha realized is that we are only relatively different from everything else in the world. We a little bit connect to everything else, and therefore we're not against the rest of the world, and it is not against us. We can interact harmoniously and so forth. Do you know what I mean? And like all beings, of course, only the mother has the feeling of the other being, of the mammal, has the feeling of the other being in her own body, and then has to bring her out of the body and cut the umbilical cord and so forth. And then for a while she still feels that baby is her, so she can be two beings, kind of. And sometimes the person who's in love feels like that. And then they say when you're a Buddha, you feel like that about every being. You feel completely they are you, the same as you. But of course, they don't feel like that, so you have to handle it in a certain way. But you actually feel that way. They say Buddha sees every living being like a mother sees her only beloved child. That close and that intimate, And that's possible because that Buddha is empty of a separate Buddha that is completely, absolutely different from everything else. Do you follow me? So, and actually a possible word for emptiness that it would be less scary to people is the word freedom. And people would be surprised because they say, oh, everybody loves freedom. Oh, we like freedom, George Bush goes, freedom, land of the free, But actually freedom is also a negation. It's an absolute negation, a megak, what we call in Tibetan philosophy, a megak, meaning we use it that way, like we say sugar-free, salt-free, trouble-free, poison-free, meaning lacking those things. So it's like less. It's like the suffix less in English, lacking.
So in freedom there has to be slavery or something attached to
What?
it. Because to have the term freedom, there needs to be also a concept such as slavery or something.
Yeah, that's right. It has an opposite, correct. So it means you're free of something. So it's negating the thing that you're free. Dam is just like nit in Dzongkha, ni, it's like an abstract suffix. So voidness, voidness is my favorite term, but anyway, emptiness or freedom or selflessness, these are all really synonyms. And what they are is negations. And negation does free you. Like when you say there's no such and such, then that means that the room is available for something else. There's no problem in this room. This room is not full of junk, therefore it's free to have nice furniture. So that's what it means. It means that the relative is free of any separate absolute things in it. And what is brilliant, you brought up brilliantly when we were in conversation, you said that therefore when you see a relative thing, you in a way are encountering the ultimate, because the ultimate is the relativity. That's quite true. But if you push that a little further, what's very brilliant about it is, once you rationally understand by inference the fact that an absolute thing is a contradiction in terms in a way, because the absolute is opposite of a relative thing, and therefore anything that was absolute could not relate to any relative thing, and therefore there couldn't be an absolute thing. There's just the absolute with no things, in a sense, But when you do that, but on the other hand, it's very important to understand emptiness, to realize, to dwell more and more on what we think is not empty. Like to understand selflessness, dagmepa, you have to understand what kind of dag it is that we lack. And when you do that, like if we look at the wall, or the viewer looks at the TV screen, the viewer doesn't just see a TV screen as an interrelational thing. They see a sort of independent, substantial TV screen. And then they see some independent, substantial Karmadendrips and Bob Thurmans in the TV screen. If you look at it, maybe the wall is a better example. You look at the wall seems to be massively established as it is, out of itself. There's a wonderful expression that what are called sociologists of knowledge have. They say things have within them the appearance of a massive facticity. In other words, there's a kind of substantial factuality about them. So when we see the wall that way, as if it was just really like itself without anybody looking at it, then we are actually wrongly investing a kind of absoluteness in the wall. So we sort of project into it a wall absolute, a wall thing in itself. The fact that even we make the error, though, by that, if once we know about relativity and emptiness, we realize, but wait, I am making the error of seeing a seemingly substantial wall, which is really only a relative wall. But the fact that I make the error means that I'm relating to it. So even if a blinding light I saw, or a vast space, and I thought that was absolute, which someone would expect absolute to be like a huge space. But because I saw it, it's not absolute. So just because I experienced it, if God even came and said, I'm God, and like, go see Pharaoh, or go do this, or like whatever, and and then I would say, well, who are you? He said, well, I'm absolute God. And I'll say, well, if you're absolute God, I wouldn't be listening to you. I couldn't be seeing you. I couldn't hear you. I'm hearing a relative voice. I see a burning bush. I see like a big light in the sky. Yeah, well, that's another story. But yeah, that's right. In a way, we can't see Sambhogakaya. It's like invisible light. But I'm just saying this issue of understanding about the relative and the absolute, which then leads us to an understanding of the ultimate non-duality, which is what Shunyata is very, very important. Because, why is it important? When I realize that all things are related, then my sense of connection to them expands and expands. By dwelling, more I reflect on it, the more I meditate on that, I feel more and more connected to everything. And the more I feel connected to everything, the more I can identify with the feelings of other beings, especially. I mean, it's harder to identify with the wood or with the wall, but I identify with the feelings of other beings. So therefore, the more wise I am, the more open-minded about the emptiness of everything, the more compassionate I am, feeling the feeling of the other beings. Do you follow me? So those two always go together like the two wings of the bird, like they say, a lot of things like that. It isn't like you come in. It's a very big mistake to think that emptiness means nothingness, and therefore nothing matters. That's absolutely wrong. Everything matters in emptiness, because we're infinitely related.
It's like the Guru Padmasambhava is said to have said that my view is as wide as the sky, but my respect for action is as fine as the flower.
That's perfect. That's perfect. In the Samadhi Raja Sutra, it says, who understands causality, cause and effect, that person understands emptiness. Which is surprising, isn't it? By knowing how things function in relationship, causal relationship, then you understand emptiness, because there's no absolute thing in the cause, no absolute thing in the effect, and therefore cause can produce the effect, because both are relative, or exclusively relative. So therefore, who understands cause and effect will understand emptiness. Whoever understands emptiness will become minutely aware of the smallest details of things, rather than float off into space or float off into nothingness. Because once you understand emptiness, you understand everything is infinitely related. When you understand everything is infinitely related, everything you do matters. There's an infinite consequence to everything. And then you become Bodhisattva. Then becoming only when you understand the total relatedness of everything does being a Bodhisattva make sense. If you only had a one life, and then you're nothing when you die, if other beings only have a one life and they became nothing when they die, you don't have to worry that much about their suffering, because it'll end very shortly, because they'll die soon, even if 100 years is soon, eventually, and when it ends, it's soon, and then there's nothing, so no consequence. And then you yourself, you can't be that good, it doesn't matter, as long as you stay comfortable, then you die, you're nothing. There's no long-term objective whatsoever. But if you're stuck with every being forever, like now you're interviewing Bob Thurman on TV, and these poor people have to listen. And then they turn it off. They just turn the switch off. That's all over, so no problem. That's the way we normally think. But actually, if we sort of realize that we're going to be doing this forever, they're going to be trying to learn this about Shunyata and compassion and relativity and so forth forever, then they were, well, I better get it straight. I better learn this. And then similarly, if there's this whole thing we do, and you do in Bhutanese Buddhism, about all beings have been your mother in previous lives. So therefore you have to be kind to all beings, and you have Ma Semjen Tam Jeji Dundu. I do this, all my mother sentient beings, you say, right? So that's kind of makes you feel connected and nice to them. But then on the other hand, if you've been a mother, you realize mothers have a lot of anxiety and problems and pain, and it's very difficult dealing with the child, and then the child grows up, and then things happen to them, and then the mother feels horrible. It's really tough to be a mother of beings. And then you think, well, if I don't get to be a Buddha, I'm going to be a mother of every single being in the future. Not only that, they're going to have to be my mother again and make them a lot of headache and heartache and bellyache. So then when that's the case, the ideal thing becomes, let's all be Buddhas, and be born by apparition, and we don't have to go through the whole thing. So I'm just saying it becomes then strictly logical that you're going to optimize your relationships with all beings by becoming a Buddha for their sake and your own sake, if you realize you're in relationship with all beings forever. If you think you can get out of relationship with them, then you'll try to get out after, you might be in love for a little while with somebody, but eventually it'll be a problem. It always is a problem, and you'll want to get away from beings. And actually, when Buddha first taught, the early monastic Buddhas were beings who were mostly men and mostly Brahmins, and they were kind of alienated from other people because they thought they were so high and important, and therefore they really wanted to get away from everybody. So he let them think nirvana was the final getaway. It was the final escape clause, escape hatch. But non-dual thing makes you realize that you're stuck here. So then you have to make the whole place better. That's really important. The key is, if you really get the vision of every being as your mother, it's as if you realize that we're all connected in the ocean of blood and milk, and there's no alien person. Actually, the secret of the culture of Tibet, Bhutan, Mongolia eventually, even India, why people there are a little less racist than some of the other cultures, is that, and therefore why other people tend to like them. Because when they look at another person, they see the person as more familiar. So it's just two different ways of doing it, you see. The emptiness thing removes the absoluteness of the sense of separation. But the mother thing is like a positive vision, bringing a sense of closeness and biological intimacy to every being. That's a deep biological realization of what eventually you realize universally for all beings. You know, it's not just, you see, it's this really science and ethics and, you know, emotional health all connect together. Einstein famously said that, and he did not do it from studying Buddhism, although he did kind of like Buddhism, he said, but he didn't really have anybody to teach it to him in that time. But he famously said that we have an optical illusion. We live in an optical illusion where we think that we are separate from the universe. And then we sometimes extend that to include our loved ones, children, or parents, or brothers and sister family, sometimes maybe teammate, maybe it can extend even further, he said. But the trick is, he said, the secret of life is to expand that circle of familiarity and of identification endlessly, where we feel one with the universe. And that's what really awakening or enlightenment is. And he said that without bringing up Buddhism. He just said it as a scientist, understanding the way to relate to reality is to connect to it, you know.
You touched upon the fact that the term emptiness itself, and then a better word might be freedom. So similarly, the next question that I have for Doctor is the word contentment. If Doctor doesn't feel that we are deviating from Doctor's chosen theme of education, but I think at the end of the day, the show itself is less. So
Containment, you're saying?
Contentment.
Oh, contentment, yeah.
Contentment in a sense, because in Chökye the term is chokshe.
Yes,
Chokshe. Chokshe. So do you feel, given your vast learning and experience, that the English term contentment properly encapsulates what the term chokshe is supposed to mean?
And I don't think it's not a bad term. Contentment is good. You know, you can say contentment is the greatest treasure.
And then now, Doctor, if Doctor would be so kind as to elaborate on the chokshe.
Contentment is the greatest treasure. Like, you know, you can be a multi-billionaire like Warren Buffett or Bill Gates or some of these recent billionaires and be very discontent because you only have 1 billion and some other guy has 50 billion. And then you're just like, I got to have more billion, and then you're paranoid to lose your billion and all this. So they say rightly that contentment is the best treasure because you're sort of rich when you're content. And you can be poor with a lot of money or a lot of wealth when you're discontent. So the point is we can meditate and contemplate. That's just, again, Buddhist psychology, about being content with whatever we have, you know, and that's very good to do. On the other hand, we don't want to become totally complacent. We don't want to live in filth or something just because we're passive. You know, people wrongly might think being content is to be sort of apathetic, but that's not, of course, true. Contentment just means to be satisfied with where it is, and then you move from that basis where, well, you want to be creative and do some more thing, that's okay, but you're not crazed about it. Like, actually, contentment would be the antidote of industrial pollution. The global warming is created by endless quest for infinite wealth by everybody and never being content, and therefore they run the planet, we're running the planet into the ground. So if people were more content with the more simple things in life, they wouldn't work all the time, they wouldn't produce, they wouldn't make so much factory, wouldn't need so much energy, and there would be enough to go around, you know, there would be enough food to share, enough money to share. So this discontentment is very negative. It's like greed, you know, and so contentment is very important. I want to come back to one other thing about emptiness too, and that is that modern science can help us understand emptiness in some very good ways. And that's why I wanted people, but I am sincere. I'm not saying in my wish and my plea to the Bhutanese Government Education Bureau to revise all the curriculum and really make a serious priority out of it. I'm not saying we should just make everybody into a lam and everybody should be a Buddhist. I don't mean that. Modern science helps. For example, that wall looks like an absolute thing in itself to me because of my ignorance and my tendency to invest it with a self of the wall itself, you know, a substance to this wall. But, you know, modern science tells me that wall is made of atoms, and those atoms are made of like completely tiny particles that spin around in some super fast way, so it's mostly empty space. And then if I go to the quantum level, even without being a professional quantum person, just go into it in the basic overview of what the quantum is, then I realize that we don't know what that wall is actually, and it is like a wave, a particle. It's a completely interactive field to my sense field, and it's like, so we know that, you know, like, you know, the famous joke about the physicist who would put snowshoes on in his laboratory. And why would he do that? Because his students finally asked him, and they said, "Professor, why are you going around the laboratory with snowshoes? There's not snowing in here, He said, "Well, when I get in the laboratory, I start thinking of matter as made up of atomic particles. And so I'm increasing my chances of not falling through the floor by putting on the snowshoes." Because he went into the mind that sees it on that level, you see. Now, in Buddhism, we have a more radical thing. How did Buddha discover Shunyata? By just some theory or by thinking some formulas? No. He discovered Shunyata because he developed such a stability of concentration of his mind that he actually got down to the subatomic interactions in his brain and in his optic nerve and in the particles of light that are shattering around amongst the things, reflecting off things and so forth. And he saw through solid objects like Superman. He saw through his seeing through. So he saw through the seeming solidity of his senses. Because in a way, you see me now, they see the screen here, our audience, and their mind is constructing out of light particles that are hitting nerve particles in their nerves, in their brain, and they're organizing all of that with all their ideas and concepts of a television screen and Kunga Dundrup and the professor and whatever, and they're recognizing it all and it's fitting with all their concepts. But if you really stabilize your mind, you get down to what you're actually doing is light particles, photons are hitting your neurons, and even below that at the quantum level, who knows what is going on. It's like really, they get down to what's called the uncertainty principle. They don't know what's going on. So Buddha did that experientially by stabilizing the mind to extreme refinement of concentration, where he literally shattered the atoms. He literally reached quantum reality experientially. And then he reached the realm of perfect freedom as indivisible with perfect relativity. He had what we call, and luckily, apparently, when your experience expands into infinite openness, it's blissful, because the sense of restriction and confinement and limitation is exploded, and there's a feeling of blissful presence everywhere. So we call it, in Tantra, at the most sophisticated level, it's called bliss, void, indivisible, or if people are afraid of void or empty, they can say bliss, freedom, indivisible. Yeah, detong yermepa, yeah, we'd say. So that you see, that's just a super subtle level of experience. Now, when Buddha was talking to the early monks and the Brahmins, he didn't really get too much into Dewa and Dewa Chembo, because that would scare them into being connected to things, and they want to escape. So he's just sort of, nirvana is the end of suffering. Obviously the end of suffering is going to be bliss, happiness, the opposite. But he just didn't emphasize that,
Emphasize the pleasure.
Yeah, it's like when you go to a concert or you have a marvelous aesthetic experience and you say, "Wow, I was really blown away." And what you mean is your normal confining sense of sort of discontent and feeling a little creaky and croaky, somehow the music or somehow the dancing or somehow whatever it was, it just blew you away, So in the school system, what I'm trying to say, when people learn basic physics, they have their physics class, like force of gravity, theory of relativity, and then Newtonian things like the apple falls, and they have little balls running up and down, like platforms, in physics classes, and they do live to learn the mechanics and things like that, right? So at that time, the laws of nature should be taught in a way that they are hypotheses. They're describing what happens on a certain level, but they're not rigid, absolute, fixed things. And that the quantum thing, without going into detail, which is very complicated mathematically, but the quantum thing and string theory and all these kind of things are like, there's an uncertainty about it all. And the uncertainty is very, very important, because the uncertainty principle means that, when you look at things at the most subtle possible level that you can with the aid of like instruments and things, where you expand the power of your senses through instruments. They have to do it through instruments because they can't do it through meditation, because they don't learn that. But they do it through instruments anyway. And when they do, then there's a place where your observation interferes with the objective thing you're observing. So actually there is no absolute objectivity in anything. because when you're trying to really pin down the subatomic event and what happens, whatever looks at it affects it. So because it's related to it. So there's no separate subject and object, and therefore the idea of absolute objectivity is illusory. And that can be learned without too much difficulty right away, where people can learn the laws of mechanics, they can learn gravity, they can learn about electromagnetism, and they can learn how it works technologically, and yet their mind is still open that these laws of nature are not absolute. They are hypothetical, in the words of the philosopher of science, Karl Popper, they are hypothetical rules based on evidence, based on experimental evidence, that account for the results of those experiments so far. But if there's other experiments that show something else, they can be revised. So we've talked about biology and karma, physics and emptiness. Right? Those two things as science things, not as religion things. Okay? So they can fit with the education. Then you brought up literature and the Buddhist literature, just as literature.
Speaking about emptiness and about how the Buddha came to the understanding of emptiness.
Yes.
And the way he came about it was, if I'm not mistaken, Doctor was saying meditation.
Yes.
And through his penetrative insight and analytical meditation.
Yes,
so
especially analytical, combined with the one-pointed, deep, laser-like concentration.
Yes. So would it be too early for us to go into the mindfulness, or would Doctor like to speak out? Yes. So if Doctor could now share with us on mindfulness and meditation, because to just get the ball rolling, to any mind, I think, first of all, when you think about being mindful, is it being mindful in a sense that, okay, I'm right now in Shualing, I'm with Robert Thurman, and two of us are in conversation,
right,
and the camera is rolling. Is that mindfulness, or is there more to it in Buddhism?
Mindfulness is being aware of all kinds of small details, yes, eventually. But what they mean by smrti, actually, the actual word, demba, means actually memory. Actually, it's what it means. And its basic meaning is memory. And so it's like taking the energy of memory and putting into remembering where you are now. It's really something like that. But let's look at it more broadly. Now, the Four Noble Truths, right? We haven't looked at them systematically in this program, but we've sort of touched on them very well. That is, if you think you're the separate essential thing in the universe will disagree, and everything you do will be some element of suffering in it. Even your pleasures will be temporary, and so they'll be called the suffering of change, right? The cause of that, then you look to diagnose the cause of that, and the cause of that is that feeling of yourself as separate, and your wrong feeling that you're an absolutely different thing, and everything else is absolutely different from you, and therefore it's very problematic how to relate to it. And so, therefore, but the prognosis of the educational system, or the therapeutical system, or the medical system, whatever you want to call it, the spiritual system, is that you can free yourself from that delusion about your separateness and your absoluteness. And when you do, you will be really happy, and you'll be in nirvana. That's the third noble truth, which of course is Buddha's great discovery. But then the fourth noble truth is, just like the second noble truth is the cause of the first noble truth, the fourth noble truth is the cause of the third noble truth. So the fourth one is the therapy, or the education system, or the actual yoga, the method by where you achieve that nirvana, you achieve the result of being free from suffering. So first branch of that is realistic worldview. People call it usually right view and right this and that. But right and wrong are like, so it's sort of fit within a rule book, This is right according to the rule, that's wrong. Whereas I like realistic because it means connected to reality of your life, So realistic worldview, and we've discussed that. And it's basically the essence of the realistic worldview is understanding relativity and understanding your connection and your relatedness to the world. That's your realistic worldview. It isn't believing that there's Buddha. It isn't believing there's former and future life. It isn't believing something that you might think would be non-rational. It's the rational belief that everything you can possibly know and everything you can possibly be is interrelated to a causal process. You know that famous verse, Ye Dharma Hetu Prabhava, Chunem Tamche Gyule Jong, right? You know that famous verse. So Buddha was discovery of causation, meaning relativity. That's another way of saying relativity, you know. And so that's realistic worldview. Then based on that realistic worldview of your total connection to everything, you have a realistic motivation about the purpose of your life. If I'm in karmic biology and I'm connected to everything and everything I do has an effect on me in the future, then I better do the right thing, because I'm going to do and behave in a realistic manner, because that's going to determine the quality of my existence in the future of this life and in many future lives. So it's very important. My seeking of happiness is my motivation, and the method of how to do it is how I put that into practice. Then the methods: I don't lie, I have a realistic livelihood, and I have realistic actions, and I make realistic efforts. So there's 4 things that have to do with the efforts, with my action, you know, and ethical type of thing, ethical and action and speech and all this. Then the last 2 things, you know, that's up to 6, right? Speech, action, livelihood, and, you know, like livelihood and effort or creativity. I like to translate it, Zunju, as creativity, because it isn't any kind of effort. It's effort in positive evolutionary action. Then the last 2 things, mindfulness is one, and samadhi is the second. Those are the 7th and 8th branch. And it's very important that samadhi is the last one, not the first one. And realistic worldview is the first one, not the last one. Because if you go into samadhi with an unrealistic worldview, with lokta, what will happen is your concentration will focus on materialism or on some absolute thing about your soul or about your absolute false, you know, wrong idea about reality, and you become more deluded, actually. The meditation will intensify your delusion. So first you have to correct, you have to develop the targeting. It's like, meditation is like when you pull the bow back and release the arrow, and it sends that arrow very powerfully. But realistic worldview is aiming the arrow. Otherwise, if you just go the arrow, you'll kill people who are drinking beer. They're drinking Red Panda over in the audience, and they'll all die. You have to aim very carefully before you pull the arrow back and release it. You know, and the releasing of it is the combination of mindfulness and samadhi. Now, mindfulness and concentration. Now, the mindfulness part is where you become introspective and you start to look into the way your mind works. And it's really a very powerful, important thing to do. I always like to say the person who has no mindfulness practice, who never tried that, and who just thinks whatever they think, and when some thought comes up in their mind, it just controls what they do and how they see. They are like a person doomed to watch one television station forever without a clicker. They cannot mute the commercial, they cannot turn it off, and they cannot switch channels when it's a really boring program. It's whatever, because they think they are the program. So what it is mindfulness means you look and see in your mind, and you know, you can start by counting your breath 1 to 10, you know, just breathing, counting 1 to 10. And when you try to count to 10 and not think of anything else, what will immediately happen is you will start thinking of other things. And when you do, you will forget to count to 4. You'll be 3, but then at 4 you're thinking about yesterday or tomorrow. Your dremba, your memory, is taking you to remember some previous thing, or in a way remember something you're worried about that you're fantasizing about, anticipating in the future. And so you'll go off on a train of thought, and your awareness will completely move away from your counting. And then the trick is, mindfulness trick is, to notice that's happened, and then to dismount from that train of thought, to jump off the train, and come back to counting, go back to 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. And you could use any other thing. Counting is just a very convenient one because we do breathe all the time, you know. And so you could say Om Mani Padme Hum, and your mind will wander off that. You come back to Om Mani Padme Hum. You don't have to only do counting, but counting is considered very basic.
Doctor, if I may ask one thing here, because when the mind wanders, okay, I'm counting till 1 till 10, and with my feeble attempts at it, and another thing that tends to happen is once you remember that, okay, I've wandered, and then you come back to again 1 to 10.
Yeah.
But then there is a part of you which feels that, oh, this sinful me, which cannot even focus on 1 till 10.
Yeah.
So I think another cautionary note there would be that to not focus on that also and to let that go also, that thought of...
So the point is, but the key is to notice that you got distracted by bringing your memory into the moment of what your mental state is, and then dissociating yourself from that thought train, and then when you and any extra reverberating thought train about how, oh, I'm so terrible, I got distracted, oh, now I'm being so terrible because I'm thinking I'm so terrible, and then, one after, but those are more, so you keep dissociating from one after another, and as you become, there will be, when you learn to do it at first, you might even think, oh, this is a terrible practice because it's making me more distracted than I ever was. But that's not true. What it is you're learning how distracted you normally are all the time. So you're not really present in all of the things that you do. And in fact, you're beginning to wake up from the living dead. The person who is unaware of how their mind works is like a living dead person. All the great yogis, Milarepa, they all say that. And even poets who are not Buddhists, like T.S. Eliot says that. He saw all the people walking across London Bridge looking like zombies. The reason they look like zombies is they're walking on the bridge, but their mind is yesterday, tomorrow. They're just completely not even noticing where they're going. They're not looking at the sky or the river or the bridge or anything or the other people. They're just in their world of their own thinking, stuck there. So mindfulness is beginning to liberate us from the trap of our habitual thinking controlling us. And once we realize how our mind works, when we have an impulse in the mind like, oh, I hate that guy, I'm going to punch him. And then we're helpless. We have to do it because our self is telling us to do it. But when you have mindfulness, you can step away from that thought and that impulse, and you can say, who says I have to do it? Who's talking? So therefore, that mindfulness is the beginning of like finding freedom in the mind. By bringing the memory, we use the English word mindfulness, but it really is the memory. Jemba means memory. In a way, it means consciousness, in the sense of purposive attention. Like when you remember something, it means you're trying to remember, you're having a purposeful attention. So what we mean by mindfulness is a purposeful attention. So those are the main four things that so far that we have gotten: psychology and logic, physics and emptiness, and karmic biology and ethics. And of course, philosophy is all interconnected there. And Western philosophy too is very good. Descartes is very good. And to learn those in connection with the logic is extremely good. So this is our job. This is the job, and what I'm saying here is the job of the Board of Education, is to figure out, get some geisha types in there, some kembos in there, and get them away from any kind of religious brainwashing, and get them to use the technical, empowerment of critical thinking and scientific thinking to discover reality in connection with those subjects that are taught that way in the modern educational system, always on the lookout for Logta and Nyandak Bitawa. But Logta and Nyandak Bitawa, notice that Tawa, it isn't really belief, it's a view. So it's not a dogma. When we say belief, we think some slogan like God is Allahu Akbar, God is great, or Buddha is great. We think it's you. I believe that statement. But no, the view is how you see the world, based on your concept about what reality is and your critical thinking about it. And so that should be taught in the school, and that's why I'm making this program. I'm hoping that they will do that. Wiser minds than me can do a better job than I can, but at least I can insist that they try to do it.
Bless. Thank you so much, Doctor. This has truly been an enlightening episode of Jangchub Shing. With camera, Chencho Wangdi, and sound, Tashi Penjo, this is Karma Dendrup, and this has been yet another episode of Jangchub Shing. Thank you for watching, and please remember our Jangchub Shing slogan: analyze and realize.